Hey everyone, how's it going? Welcome back to the channel. So soon, I'm back one day later, believe it or not, because I'm doing another contest entry. So this one, as I mentioned before, is for Dennis from Analog Archives. So Dennis recently reached 2,000 subscribers, which is an incredible achievement. I remember last year, I did a response to his 1,000 subscribers contest. That was only a year ago, so it's doubled in a year. Absolutely amazing, but well deserved because Dennis is really knowledgeable about extreme metal music and he's got a very diverse and massive collection, and he's also a really down-to-earth guy. So I'm definitely jumping on this competition, and also it's a very interesting topic. So congratulations, Dennis, really well deserved, and I look forward to giving you this response. So what Dennis has asked us to do for this particular contest is show 10 sophomore or second albums by a band that are better than the debut album. The reason being, I think that it's often said, he said most people latch on to the first album and that's always revered as the legendary, groundbreaking one. But in some cases, the second album or the sophomore album is obviously better, and I certainly agree with that. In fact, in my experience, some of my favorite albums by a band are the sophomore albums. And something else, at first I thought, this is going to be, I'm spoiled for choice. There's so many bands I can look at, but when I thought about it carefully, I realized that there are a lot of bands where the first album is actually better. So I had to think about it a bit, but then after that, the list came together very quickly. So, of course, remember, this is just my opinion, so if you disagree, you don't have to get upset or angry. You know, it's just opinion, and it's all subjective, isn't it? So remember, these are albums which, in my view, these sophomore albums are better than the debut by a particular band. All right, so without further ado, we will get into it. Enough rambling. God, it's been 2 minutes. All right, so my first choice, Alcatraz with Disturbing the Peace. This may be considered a controversial choice because I think most people would say, most fans would say that the debut, No Parole from Rock and Roll, is their legendary album. No doubt it's a brilliant one. Of course, Alcatraz was formed by Graham Bonnet, formerly of Rainbow and also one-time vocalist of Michael Schenker Group. Yeah, he formed his own band in the vein of Rainbow and formed it with guitar hero Yngwie Malmsteen for No Parole from Rock and Roll, the debut. Yes, that album is absolutely great, don't get me wrong, and it's got some excellent songs like Hiroshima, Mon Amour, and Krina Kuri. You know, so many good songs, except this one I think is so much better, honestly. This saw a change in personnel. Yngwie Malmsteen, after an ego battle with Graham Bonnet, was replaced by guitar hero Steve Vai on this album. And I'm not necessarily saying it's due to the change in guitarists, but it could be an influence, sure. But I just think this album has much better songs. This has much more of a sort of 80s atmosphere and synth rock, you know, using a lot of keyboards and everything, which has always been a big part of Alcatraz, but it's just got that quintessential classic 80s atmosphere. And I just love the songs on this album. I think there are so many more standout tracks on this album, and it's got that real 80s vibe. So songs like, yeah, God Bless Video, brilliant, you know, with that keyboard intro, fantastic. Also, Wire and Wood, Desert Diamond, very atmospheric. Skyfire, oh God, and Graham's vocals make it so atmospheric. So yes, controversial opinion, but I just think overall, much better songs, much catchier, and a much better atmosphere. So this sophomore album is better than the debut, Alcatraz, Disturbing the Peace. Okay, coming up to the second choice. All right, my second choice, this is Burzum with Det Som En Gang Var. So, of course, Burzum is a well-known and controversial band due to Varg's extracurricular activities, you know, both in the early 90s and beyond that. But for me, I just like the music by this band. But obviously, the debut album by Burzum, the self-titled one, was groundbreaking with those tortured, screamed vocals, you know, blood-curdling vocals, and very lo-fi sound and sort of abrasive, harsh atmosphere. But I just think this album is, again, better. You know, more memorable songs, more standout tracks. The tracks stand out apart from each other more. And yeah, with the first one, I find the vocals, they get to me a bit sometimes. You know how they're really high-pitched, blood-curdling shriek. It just gets a bit irritating at times, whereas this album, I just find most of the songs are really good. The intro and outro are just some noise ambient tracks, so they don't really count. But then you've got Key to the Gate, great song, you know, sort of a kind of headbanging track for black metal. En Ring till a Herska, so one ring to rule them all, a bit atmospheric with the Viking dirgy vocals. Lost Wisdom, great catchy chugging riff in that, which could almost be an L7 riff if you think about it, but just rocky and catchy. So you see how each song is very diverse. Is it Hansom Reister, the keyboard track, which is medieval sounding. And then one of my favorite tracks, Ner Himmelen Klana, so when as skies clear, so that's an instrumental guitar track. And yeah, track 7, I can never read that one. That's one, it's aggressive and fast again. So, but I just think all of these songs, as you can probably tell, they're very distinct from one another. They stand out a lot more. So to me, this was much better than the debut. And I think with Burzum's albums, they just got better and better. Pre-Prison, like the one after this, the third one, Hvis Lucet Taos, is my favorite. And then Philosophen, it could be argued, was even better than that. But yeah, for me, this is definitely, as the sophomore, that's on Engang Va, much better than the debut. All right. So coming up to the next one, Cradle of Filth with Cruelty, no, not Cruelty and the Beast. What am I saying? Right. Dusk and Her Embrace. Yeah, so this is an example of where the sophomore album, this one, is actually my favorite by the band. Of course, I love the debut, The Principle of Evil Made Flesh. That's emulating the Scandinavian and particularly Norwegian sound. So The Principle of Evil Made Flesh, it does have those vampiric elements, but it's still, I think, taking a lot of influence from Nordic bands such as Emperor. Whereas on this album, they found their sound more, I think, their own original sound. So they started developing that gothic, romantic kind of atmosphere and imagery. And again, the songs are just so much more elaborate and sophisticated and diverse. There's a lot of twists and turns in all the songs, so many classical elements, so many keyboards, the range in Danny's vocals. I just think everything is much more memorable about this album. So don't get me wrong, the debut, Principle of Evil Made Flesh, is great, but I think this one is even better. And I remember when I bought this in 1998, I think I've mentioned before, I listened to this album pretty much every day that year. I was really hooked on it. So yeah, no, I mean, I could just read all of the tracks because they're brilliant, but I think hands down, it is the best Cradle of Filth album, so certainly better than the debut. So that's Cradle of Filth with Dusk and Her Embrace. I got the name right this time. All right. Okay, and coming up next, another sophomore, which I think is better than the debut. This is Dissection with Storm of the Light's Bane. So you will have seen I've already done a Dissection ranking video, and I ranked this as first. Sorry, spoiler alert. So you will know that. Yeah, again, the debut, the Somberlane, is fantastic, but as I mentioned in my ranking video, the Somberlane, I think it's very much to do with this cold melody and atmosphere. It's much more of an atmosphere-based album, and there's nothing wrong with that because it's a brilliant atmosphere. But with this album, again, I think the songs are just, they stand out apart from one another, and again, they're much more memorable. Like I find with this album, I can sing along, you know, to the lyrics, and I know the sections of the song which are coming up, whereas the Somberlane, it has a sort of ambient backgroundy quality. But this one saw the band really gelling and firing on all cylinders. It's undoubtedly their best album. So this is another example, in my opinion, of the Sophomore being the best album by the band. So yeah, you all know it, but some of my favorite songs here, I can't read because this light is shithouse. But you know, Where Dead Angels Lie, Thorns of Crimson Death, the title track. Yeah, so many, sorry. You know all of the songs, so I don't need to read them out. But I mean, I love pretty much every song on this album. It's just a classic from start to finish. So that's Dissection with Storm of the Light's Bane. All right. Coming up next, another sophomore, which I think is better than the debut, Enslaved, Frost. So yes, I've talked about this album before too. Of course, the debut album, Viking Leader Veldi, was a fantastic album. That was very innovative in the sense that it was black metal adopting a Viking theme, which hadn't really been done, apart from Bathory, but Enslaved did it in a sort of new age way, like in an innovative way, especially the way they used keyboards, and they used like Old Norse and Icelandic language to write the lyrics and everything, but it had a very sort of a Nordic Viking atmosphere. This album, however, it went more for a sort of It retained those Viking elements, but it went more for a sort of straightforward black metal approach. But again, just much better songwriting in my opinion. The songs were much more memorable and they really stand out apart from one another once again. Yeah, so again, this is another case of the Sophomore being my favorite album by the band. It undoubtedly is. So many classic tracks like Frost, Loka, Fenris, Svarta Vida, Yggdrasil, Jotunblod, Gylfaginning, Votan, Isurdas Dronning. I just read all of them because they're brilliant. Yep, this album is 10 out of 10. So again, don't get me wrong, I think the first album was fantastic, but that was more like, again, sort of an overall atmosphere album, a bit like in the same sense that the Somberlane was for Dissection, whereas this album had much more memorable songs in general. So that's my next choice, Enslaved Frost. Okay, so coming up next, another Sophomore which was better than the debut in my opinion. This is Enthroned with Towards the Skull Throne of Satan, and believe it or not, once again, this is my favorite album by the band, so another Sophomore which is the best in my opinion. Yep, so Enthroned, of course, are a black metal band from Belgium, have been around since the mid-90s. The debut album was Prophecies of Pagan Fire, which was a very good album, and they still had that distinct, you know, Enthroned have always been unique. They've always done things a little bit differently anyway, even on the first album, with the guitar and vocal style, especially Sabathan's, you know, shrieking vocals and everything. But the first album, I think, it took a lot of influence again from Scandinavian black metal, particularly Emperor, with the use of the keyboards, and also there were lyrical references like I raise my inverted cross in the night side eclipse. Where did that come from? You know, things like that. And as the bells of the Black Millennium toll, something like that, but that sounds very influenced by Immortal. Whereas on this album was much more guitar oriented. They still use keyboards, but there was much more focus on the use of guitars and melodies and harmonies, not relying so much on keyboards, and they didn't have as, you know, kind of cliched Nordic lyrics. On the first album, they were describing, you know, Nordic landscapes, even though the band's from Belgium, nothing wrong with that, but this one, it was going more into the sort of spiritual, satanic side. But ultimately, it's the music that counts. Again, just great diversity on this album. There are some keyboards, some acoustic guitars, but the guitar melodies, the song structures, the songs are all just really distinct and stand out. So some of my favorites on this album: The Ultimate Horde Fights, Harsh Shaitan, Evil Church, Dusk of Forgotten Darkness is my favorite song. If you haven't heard that, go and listen to it. Brilliant. And of course, Hertogenwald. But yeah, this is undoubtedly my favorite Enthroned album of all time. So again, the debut, Prophecies of Pagan Fire, the band was still finding their feet, you know, developing their sound. But I think this was the one where they really gelled as a band and developed their own individual, unique sound. So, Enthroned with Towards the Skull Throne of Satan. Great album. If you haven't checked it out and you like black metal, do so. All right, what have we got next? All right, so a lot of people are probably getting sick of me talking about this album, but here you go. Goatmoon with Finnish Steel Storm. So yes, I've mentioned before, the very first debut album was Death Before Dishonor, and that, yes, that was a good album, but as I've mentioned before, it wasn't that unique, so there wasn't so much to set it apart from other black metal, generally speaking. I mean, there was still Black Goat's unique riffing style, but the first album, Death Before Dishonor, it was very raw, and the drumming was very clattery and violent in a sort of messy and out of time way. Whereas this album, this really is striking. It stands apart. It was a lot more, this one is a lot more melodic, a lot catchier, bouncy rhythms, folky elements like the use of flutes and keyboards. There's just so much and diversity going on. So I think it's just a much more interesting and catchy album in every respect, easily, hands down, way better than the debut. And again, I think this was the album where the band established their sort of unique riffing style and their folky sound. And once again, guys, this is actually my favorite album by the band, the Sophomore. So who says Sophomore albums are no good? Like, there's no bad tracks on this. They're all brilliant. It's so catchy. The other two albums I like by this band a lot, which would be close contenders to this one, would be Voito, Tai Valhalla, and Variot. But this is undoubtedly my favorite. So the best album by this band is also the Sophomore. So Goatmoon with Finnish Steel Storm. All right. And coming up to some more black metal. Okay, this next band is fantastic. So Nocturnal Mortem with To the Gates of Blasphemous Fire. So yes, of course, this is the sophomore album by this band. The debut was Goat Horns, and that is a very good album. This band has never released a bad album, really, so they're all great. So was Lunar Poetry, Nechrist, The Voice of Steel, all brilliant, but this is way better than the debut. Goat Horns, even that had the song Coliada, which is great closing track, but this is, again, the sophomore album. It's also my favorite by the band. It's just a lot more melodic, bombastic, and symphonic than the first album. So the songs are much more majestic and atmospheric. If you've never heard this particular album, the way I would describe it is it sounds a lot like Emperor's Anthems to the Welcome at Dusk. Well, not like it, but if you like that album, you will probably like this too. The difference is there's more of an Eastern European influence in terms of the musicianship and the melodies and that kind of thing. So think of Anthems to the Welcome at Dusk, but with a more Eastern European vibe and feel, which is fantastic. You know, it's very atmospheric. The keyboards are going the whole time, and it's just melodic. You're humming along to the tunes. Absolutely brilliant album. It's hands down my favorite. And then, of course, after this album, they went in a sort of folkier direction, and then they married that kind of folky aspect to the bombastic symphonic one with The Voice of Steel, which is a fantastic album too. But yeah, this is undoubtedly my favorite, where it all began in terms of the best sound for me, and again, much better than the debut. So that's Nocturnal Mortem with To the Gates of Blasphemous Fire. All right, so we're not going too badly for time, guys. Just got 2 albums left. The next couple of albums everyone's gonna know probably, and I'm sure I'm not alone when I say this, but yes, easy choice, Obituary with Cause of Death. So again, wow, this is my favorite album by the band, the sophomore album. Yes, of course, so the debut, Slowly We Rot, that was a legendary album, groundbreaking because no one had heard that vocal style, which John Tardy did, and you know, that sort of sludgy, heavy, pseudo-thrashy sound which they did, which evolved into death metal. But speaking honestly and candidly about Slowly We Rot, like Mr. Boulder said, there are some fantastic songs on that, and I don't deny it, but there are some other ones which don't stand out as much on that album. So I think there are a few which sort of are filler or descend into ambience, whereas this album, the sophomore Cause of Death, every song is just classic. Like the band had obviously upped their game in terms of musicianship, and that helped with the addition of James Murphy on lead guitar, but there was just so much more darkness and atmosphere on this album, and I found that the songs just stand out so distinctly, much more distinctly than Slowly We Rot. Like some of my favorites, of course, no, I could read all of these again, but some of my absolute favorites, Chopped in Half, Circle of the Tyrants, which is the Celtic Frost cover. Yes, it's Celtic. There's always debate over that. Also, yeah, Memories Remain, but yeah, you guys know this album, but for me it's way better than Slowly We Rot, and not only that, but it's my favorite album by the band ever. Yeah, so Obituary, Cause of Death. And last one on the list, 6 Feet Under with Warpath. So 6 Feet Under is, of course, that kind of, they started out as a supergroup because it featured Chris Barnes, previously of Cannibal Corpse, and Alan West, previously of Obituary, on guitar. Well, yeah, they started it out as a side project, but then it became a full-time project. It also featured Greg Gall on drums and who's the other guy? Terry Butler on bass from Massacre and now in Obituary. But yes, this was, the debut was Haunted, and most people say that Haunted is their best album ever. I don't deny that Haunted is a great album. That was sort of interesting because it was like an interesting combination. It was the musically it sounded a lot like Obituary. Vocally it sounded a lot like Cannibal Corpse, so that was a really interesting combination. However, on the debut Haunted, I feel like it's got a kind of sluggish feel, like the songs could be a bit faster, it's a bit pedestrian sounding. Like, you know, the songs themselves are great, but I think they could be sped up. They sound a bit languid and slow, whereas this album, I think the band really came into their own and found their own sound. It still featured Alan West on guitar, so you can definitely hear his guitaring style, but just straightforward, more straightforward riffs, I would say, but it's not as slow. They're sort of bouncier and catchier and faster riffs on this. there's much more vocal diversity from Chris, who started experimenting with all those different voices, like the pig squeals and the high-pitched screams and everything. But really, just so much diversity on this album, and I think there are some really original ideas. For example, on the song 420, which is a great song, Chris even breaks into some clean vocals, which I thought, oh, that's original. And another thing about this album is it's very groove oriented, so the riffs and the vocal lines are often repeated. And I remember initially reading that and going, oh, there's not much to the lyrics, but it's more about the delivery, the vocal patterns and everything. But I think it made for a really bouncy, catchy album. And I just love it. The band I was in, we used to cover songs from this album. So fun to play, and also so fun to listen to this album. Some of my favorite songs: Non-Existence, A Journey into Darkness, Animal Instinct, Burning Blood, my favorite song for sure. Also 420, great song. Revenge of the Zombie, As I Die, yeah, just classic stuff. So I do have the CD version, which has got the photo of the band. That's better than this one, but I just thought I'd show this because it's kind of iconic. But yes, I think this is much better than the debut Haunted, and in addition to that, once again, this is my favorite album by the band. So that's my list of 10, guys. That was 6 Feet Under, Warpath. So let me see, wow, 9 of those 10 choices in that list are not only better than the debut, but actually my favorite by the band. There you go. So who says Sophomore albums are weak albums? Not at all. So there it is, guys. Remember, if you disagree with my choices, thinking the debut's better, that's fine, but you don't have to have an argument with me. That's what opinions are for. So hope you enjoyed the video. And Dennis, once again, congratulations on reaching 2,000 subs. I hope you enjoyed the video too. The reason I'm doing so many videos at the moment is over the next few weeks I'm going to be very busy and I won't have time to make any more. So I'll be in absentia for a few weeks, but we'll be coming back with another video shortly, and I'm going to do my own thread soon, so more to come on that. But in the meantime, I hope you guys continue to watch. Please consider subscribing if you haven't. I really appreciate your support, and take care until next time. Cheers.